We are a very curious species. Since the beginning of civilization, we've always strived to learn and understand as much as we could. Early on, it was necessary for our survival to understand as much of our surroundings as possible. If we didn't know what food to eat and what food to avoid, then we wouldn't have lasted very long. As time has progressed, our thirst for knowledge has not quieted down. The only difference is how we obtain and consume this information. We are always eager to hear the latest news about anything, even if it was happening thousands of miles away from us. Fortunately, obtaining news has become one of the easiest tasks for us to do, and that is due to the internet. But before we talk about the internet, we should talk about how news used to enter our daily lives and how it has evolved since then. News used to travel slow, like real slow. In order to get news, you had to depend upon a traveler passing along to tell you what's been going on around you. It might be years before you hear about, say, your uncle dying, if you even happen to hear about that at all. That thing we all do when we see someone we know on the street and we go, "Hey, what's going on?" or "What's new?" all goes back to when we really needed to know what was going on, because that person might be able to tell you something important. These days, when you ask that question, you're most likely to hear something about their new health cleanse or who they are supporting in the presidential election. You know, things you don't really care about. The problem with news traveling by word of mouth is reliability. Anyone can just make up a story or change some facts. If you've ever played the classroom game Telephone, then you know exactly how easy it is for things to change. But as our civilization grew, so did our amount of information and how we transfer that information. The next step in that evolution was written news. The Postal Service allowed distant friends and relatives to stay connected with each other by sending the occasional letter. Telegraphs made it possible to send a message easily over a wide distance. Telegraphs also turned words into a sort of commodity. You would have to pay a couple cents per word to send, so people had to start getting creative and shorten their language, much like how texting works today. So perhaps in the 1800s, people were sending LOLs and LMAOs back and forth. But the biggest written news source to come about was, of course, the newspaper. The newspaper collected all the important, well, somewhat important news from around town and put it together for people to easily be informed. These publications easily allowed news to be spread further and reach more people than ever before. Now, the people who could never afford to go anywhere besides their home could find out about some dude who lives 3 states over. Newspapers dominated as the main source of news until technology and innovation finally caught up with them. As great as newspapers were, they were not very fast. If an update in a story occurred, people had to wait until the next day, or at least a couple hours until the evening edition of the paper was released. That problem was solved with radio and television. These two inventions allowed news to be broadcasted almost as quick as it was happening. All reporters and journalists would have to do is confirm stories, and they could be informing thousands of people in no time. Breaking news stories became the new big thing, with news outlets interrupting broadcasts to talk about a new story. Broadcasted news dominated for decades, and it is still a dominant force in the industry. But a new challenger has appeared in recent years that's giving all the other news sources a run for their money. Literally. This challenger is, of course, the thing we know and love: the internet. The internet, in its very young existence, has made almost every industry rethink its strategy. Travel agents are barely a thing thanks to online travel sites. Book sales have fallen because Why would you lug around a bag of books when you could carry around thousands of novels and textbooks on a little screen that weighs a couple pounds? The first big change to news the internet allowed was how we actually collected our news. People used to have to pull their news towards them. That is, if you wanted to hear about the latest updates about a conflict, say halfway around the world, you had to actively go and get it. You had to buy a paper, or turn on the TV, or call someone who actually knew about it. The internet allowed for the news to actually push towards the consumer. This meant that the news would come to the people instead of the people coming to the news. This was made possible mostly due to RSS feeds. You know, those little orange boxes that you always ignore on every website. RSS stands for Rich Site Summary, or Really Simple Syndication. RSS feeds allowed a user to subscribe to a page that they typically go to and get set updates that would collect in an RSS reader that kind of looked like a email account. Every site that you subscribed to would send updates and new articles to your reader, which allowed you to quickly and easily look at what you wanted to read and what you just wanted to skip over. This allowed users to stop wasting valuable time surfing the web, hoping for a new article or story to read, and they could focus on the things that actually mattered to them. Now, a big reason internet news became so popular was because it took the best aspects of previous news outlets and made a conglomeration of the best and the, well, not so best attributes. The internet had the speed of television, the massive spread of printed news, and the complete unreliability of word-of-mouth news. But in addition to those aspects, the internet made a radical change to how news is created. It allowed everyone to become the journalist. The users, who an NYU journalism professor likes to call the people formerly known as the audience, were given the ability to become the writer, the reporter, and the editor. According to a Pew Research study, 37% of internet users have contributed to the creation of news, commented about it, or disseminated it via postings on social media sites. Now, that number is from 2010, so I can only speculate as to what that number is 6 years later. One of the biggest reasons for this radical news change is something that was born only 10 years ago. A new social networking site called Twitter. Twitter began as a place for people to shout off into the abyss about things that no one cares about, and to be honest, it still mostly is. But it has also become one of the media's strongest tools for the spread of information. I mean, it was Twitter where the world first learned about Captain Sully making an emergency crash landing on the Hudson River. Hundreds of people began tweeting about how they saw a plane falling into the river. Pictures of the plane soon flooded everyone's timelines. People didn't want to just tell anyone what they saw, they wanted to tell everyone, so they turned to Twitter. Only a couple months after the miracle on Hudson, an even bigger story was first revealed on Twitter. This time, it was the killing of Osama bin Laden. Over an hour before President Obama confirmed the news, the former Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense tweeted about it. Twitter did a better job of spreading the news than the actual President of the United States. But even before all of that, hours before all of that, a man in Pakistan unknowingly live tweeted the covert mission to get Osama. Before long, the story stopped being about bin Laden and started being about this man who is probably the only person to ever broadcast a secret mission to millions and still be alive. And he did it all by accident. But as fantastic as those stories are, the total freedom of the internet can also be used very poorly. Take, for example, the Malaysia Airlines plane that went missing a few years ago. As people were scrambling to figure out what happened, a tweet was sent out saying they safely landed in China. News stations immediately began rushing around trying to corroborate the story. Unfortunately, it ended up being a false rumor. But since that man was no real news source or anything, he bared no responsibility to actually fact check before spreading such a rumor and giving tons of false hope to the families of the passengers. He probably was hoping he could get as famous as the man who tweeted about bin Laden. Even though the people formerly known as the audience have taken over control of news cycles, the former giants of the news world still reign supreme. Well, at least the ones that adapted to the internet. Last summer, the New York Times surpassed 1 million online subscribers. Now that doesn't take into account the number of people who read the free content on the website, including myself, so that number is probably much higher. Since 2012, internet revenue for news outlets has surpassed print revenue, and that number just keeps getting higher and higher every single year. So, sure, some people might argue that the internet has driven us to become an isolated species who would rather stay inside alone than go hang out with others. But I would say that it's actually made a much more closely connected species. I mean, I can now play video games with an 11-year-old kid from Brazil who will somehow beat me every game and then make rude comments about my mother. I mean, I used to be only able to play with my friends when they came over to my house, and they wouldn't dare make fun of my mom because they know just how sweet she is. But yeah, the internet allowed me to expand my connections and has absolutely increased our knowledge of the world and each other. So let's be happy that news is so easy now.